start by introducing. Oh, and you're recording this. Okay. So can people watch it later?
Yes.
Then? Okay.
And okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely.
Okay.
Where do they find it, the recording? Do you put it somewhere?
On YouTube.
On YouTube. Okay. All right. Good to know. All right. Glad I got my lipstick on.
You're ahead of us.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, first for the invitation. I am Amy Cheshire, and I'm a clinical social worker and family therapist and couples therapist, and as well as do a fair amount of clinical research at the University of Rochester in the Department of Neurology. I'm part of the Movement Disorders Division, which some of you may be familiar with. We take care of people that suffer from any type of movement disorder. We are also a Parkinson Foundation Center of Excellence. There are about, I think, well over 50 centers of excellence now across us, and in some European locations as well. And for people that aren't familiar with, you probably are, but the whole mission of centers of excellence is to really provide outpatient care and education and support and clinical trials, really trying to be kind of a center of action, if you will, to help take care of people within our communities that are dealing with Parkinson's Foundation. So that's kind of who we are and a little bit about me. I've been there for quite a long time. I never know if that's good or bad anymore, quite honestly, but so but today what I was going to focus in on, we had gone back and forth a little bit about topics, and this was actually a talk that I gave, boy, probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when the Parkinson's Foundation had the Rochester chapter. And for people that knew Dr. Michelle Burak, she was very involved at that time, and we did kind of this joint talk, but I've changed it and updated it a fair amount, but I kind of used it as a kind of skeleton, if you will, outline to talk about some different things today. My hope is that people will walk away from this, you know, really taking away some common things that tend to creep up that can create a fair amount of challenges, both from the person with Parkinson's as well as the care partner. I'm really speaking to both of you because I think you're both equally important. So the talk is not just tailored to one group or the other, because that's just kind of how I operate. But to talk about some of the common challenges, how those challenges have seemed to ebb and flow and changed to some degree, to talk about the role of grief in some of this, because that is kind of a hallmark, a thread that can run through the Parkinson's journey. To dabble a little bit into pandemic kind of related issues now that we are in a much different place than when I gave my first kind of Zoom PD pandemic talk, which was well over probably at least a year ago, if not more. So to kind of highlight where we're at now with that as well. And then to wrap up with, I hope some more nuts and bolts kind of things that are actionable. So that's kind of my plan. And we'll get started. So I usually start with this slide. This is actually of my parents. I start there because my dad, who has since passed away just about 3.5 years ago now, after a pretty long battle with Parkinson's himself. They are based out in Southern California, where I was born and raised until I fell in love with a native Rochesterian and made my way to some place called Rochester, New York, which of course, being typical Southern California, had never even heard of. So anyway, so I kind of always pay homage a little bit to these folks. And I think for both of them, but my mom in particular, who's still very much alive and doing great at age 87, and has gone through quite a long, well over a decade or more of taking care of my dad with Parkinson's, and now going on to a new phase of her life following his death. So I always kind of come back to this idea about home really should be, we hope, kind of the place that catches us all when we fall. And to really, hopefully people can feel like their home is a really safe place. Of course, that's taken on some different meanings now with COVID than it used to. But I always keep these folks in the back of my mind whenever I'm talking about anything to do with Parkinson's. So these are some questions that you don't, normally if I was doing this live, we do a little show of hands for these kind of things. But I think it's always a good reminder. These are some simple questions that, especially from a care partner perspective, but quite honestly, they're probably good questions for people with Parkinson's as well. The sense of, are you keeping some kind of connection to your primary care doctor or your internist, and at least annually, is a good thing to just kind of remember. I think generally this probably isn't as much of an issue. Sometimes we can be going to our internist a little bit too much. Okay. And that can be an opposite problem, quite honestly. But making sure that you at least feel like you have a pretty good relationship going with your internist, I think is super critical. This other one about, and I bolded or highlighted or capitalized, I should say, accepting assistance from others. And I'll dive into that a little bit more as we go along. This sounds relatively easy on the surface, but the reality is it can be incredibly difficult for people to accept assistance. And there's a lot of things that kind of go into those waters that can make this harder. But I think as time goes along, the more you can get to baby step this, if necessary, to get a little bit more comfortable accepting assistance from other people, and how to do that. And we'll chat a little bit more about that as we go along. And of course, talking to other people about your feelings, and the emphasis is feelings, okay? Not what you're doing, how you're doing it, your behaviors, those kind of things, which are way easier to talk about, especially when it comes to something like PD, than kind of what's going on inside your heart, inside your gut, okay? So really trying to work on, this is an ongoing process, of course, for all of us. Some people are much more adept at this than others, but having other people available that you can really kind of share what's going on at a feeling level. Really, we know all of this kind of comes from our research around, managing burden levels and keeping your health going as well as possible. So these three things are nice to just kind of keep check in for yourself. All right, so one of the big things that's kind of come up around in the Parkinson's literature is this idea of resilience. And, we used to focus a lot on, and we still do to some degree, what is it about Parkinson's that makes it so difficult for everyone? And I think more and more we have a pretty good understanding about that, and I'll chat a little bit about that. But the flip side of that is also trying to understand what seems to help some people do better with this than others, sort of what's the secret sauce in a way, and so this gets at a little bit of that. We know a couple ideas, and here they are. Some of it, quite honestly, starts with a person with Parkinson's, which of course makes 100% sense. How are they doing in terms of managing their own symptoms? Okay. And of course, this probably absolutely changes throughout the course of the disease. And I completely understand that. And I perhaps more so earlier on. But the reality is that sometimes we, as caregivers, care partners, we can start to sort of overmanage. Okay. And I'll continue to kind of talk about this theme. So the more that the person with Parkinson's can really take what we call agency or ownership of their own symptoms within reason, what they can do, and obviously knowing that's going to shift, that seems to overall make things go a little bit easier for everyone involved. And in line with that is sort of what I put here, division of work, which actually doesn't sound like a good way of putting that. But how are you kind of dividing things up in terms of quote unquote managing Parkinson's? You know, whether this is coming around medication management, whether this is coming around appointment reminders, you know, is there pretty, you know, you think back to when you were maybe raising children and whatnot, you know, what was sort of the division of labor? And it's not that much different now with something like Parkinson's in terms of how uneven is it feeling at times? Does it feel like there is kind of a good distribution? So the more it kind of gets a little bit more like a teeter-totter, starts getting really out of whack, right? That's when we see people's overall level of stress, how well they're feeling, both from the care partner and the person with Parkinson's. So trying to think about that and how is that sort of division of labor going can often be a big help. Gender, interesting enough, plays a role here. And what we know about that is actually male caregivers, and I've talked about this in the past because people often, I don't know, get a little upset when I say this, but historically, male caregivers actually report less burden, feel less stressed than their female counterparts. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of ideas about it. But one is that men tend to go at caregiving in a little bit more what I would call problem-focused approach. And they don't tend to have as much as sort of the emotional focused approach that I'm afraid many women may, not always, but may bring more to the task at hand. And it's that emotionality about it that often can, not always, but can kind of perhaps make female caregivers feel a little bit more stressed than their male caregivers. And I think both can learn something from one another. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I do think it is interesting and important to kind of highlight some of those differences. I certainly encounter this in my own practice. You know, I see many folks with Parkinson's for counseling and support, and often can see this kind of play itself out in real time as well. Some of that may be just the wiring, right, that happens with men versus women. Men tend to kind of be able to compartmentalize things a little bit better than a lot of females can. So that probably plays into it. But I think it's just one of those pieces of caregiving that we often don't often talk about or think about. The other one, big one, is interesting enough, is especially when you first started, when you think back, if you're well into Parkinson's or if you're earlier into it, but in the early days when things kind of first got started, let's say the first, 1 to 5 years or so, what was in particular the caregiver, or the, as we call them, the well spouse, if you want, how much did you feel negative about having Parkinson's in your lives, and what we call degree of pessimism? Okay. And you really have to kind of think back to this and sort of what was your frame of mind when you first heard about Parkinson's, when you were first coming to kind of terms with this diagnosis. And I think this also goes for the person with Parkinson's. I highlighted about the care partner, but I think it goes for both people. Sort of what was your perception at the time of having Parkinson's? And that seems to, interesting enough, carry over into then 10 years later or 15 years into Parkinson's, et cetera, into people having sort of more overall negative sort of health outcomes. And that's not necessarily because someone's Parkinson's is progressing, but that people are just overall having a harder time kind of managing the idea that their Parkinson's is progressing, that some of that seems to stem from what was the story you told yourself when the diagnosis first hit. And that's why I often always, when I see a new patient, for example, often always ask, tell me the story of getting diagnosed. And I emphasize story, okay, because usually there is a story. It can be a short story or a long story, but what was the story that you came to be told and to discover that you had something called Parkinson's? So that's interesting. How did you deal with prior life storms? I guess some of the beauty, if there is, about Parkinson's primarily being a later onset, if you will, disease, is that people have often weathered a lot of challenges, right, way before Parkinson's entered this situation. And so you can, and this is really from a family therapy perspective, is really you can rely on and think back and remember back to, well, how did we get through that? You know, whether it was, you know, the sudden death of someone in your family, maybe it was a financial crisis, maybe it was a work crisis, maybe it was, you know, a lot of challenges raising children, maybe it's challenges with adult children, but how have you weathered those prior life storms really can go a long way to helping to guide how you're going to weather this life storm, right? And so you've sort of gathered some fair amount of experience versus someone, I think that, you know, in particular, our younger onset people with Parkinson's that get diagnosed maybe in their 40s, for example, don't tend to have as much life history there in weathering these life storms. And so I think sometimes that contributes to making those folks have a bigger lift and some harder challenges in dealing with Parkinson's at that age. So how did you manage prior things? And can you, more importantly, draw on those now to help you with this life storm? And this last one, which is another kind of common question that I'll ask folks about, couples in particular, is, you know, tell me, and usually I try to narrow this down to make it a little bit easier for people, but, you know, in 3 to 5 words, right? Adjectives, ideally. How would you describe your relationship prior to Parkinson's entering the situation? Okay. And when you ask people to more narrow it down like that, it makes it harder, but it also makes it easier in some ways. Okay. Because, and why in the world do we ask about that? Well, it's very much this last question, which I know, you know, how are things going prior, right? I think there are a lot of false assumptions that people in neurology can make, that they see a couple, let's say, they've been married, let's say 35, 40 years. The gentleman, I'm just going to say in this case, gets diagnosed with Parkinson's somewhere in mid-70s. And a lot of providers may just falsely, in some ways, make a lot of assumptions that, well, you've been together this long, it must be a pretty good darn relationship. Okay. And sometimes, of course, that's true, but a lot of times it's not, you know? And so really recognizing what was life like way before Parkinson's entered the situation can also be another kind of one of those guiding lights about how things are going to go. In other words, of course, if you had a pretty challenging go of it okay, for whatever reason, but a lot of strife or a lot of conflict or a lot of unhappiness. And then you sort of get slammed with something like Parkinson's. You can imagine the impact that's going to have versus maybe a relationship that didn't have so much of that. So that's where this issue, you know, is important to recognize and to be mindful of that. Of course, you can't go back, right, and change it, okay? But I think recognizing that this can often play into how people manage things going forward. All right, so to get into some of, I started off by saying I was going to hit some of the challenges and some of the things that in particular can kind of trip people up. And hopefully people can relate to this, especially the person with Parkinson's, for reasons, again, that we don't totally understand, quite honestly, as researchers or scientists. But I think as Parkinson's moves along, that some folks just start to kind of become a little bit more, what I said, turn more inward, what people might think of as being more introverted, perhaps. And communication just starts to kind of dwindle a little bit, right? And when I say communication, I'm talking about all forms of communication. So verbal communication, behavioral communication, what you're doing, not doing, nonverbal communication, which of course gets more compromised related to Parkinson's. So any form of communication. And these are some quotes which I like to use because they're from real life. I get lonesome. I don't think he notices. For me, it's like he's there, but he's not there. It's me talking all the time. I probably hear that phrase a lot in my office, but once in a while, he'll surprise me. With PD, you don't talk as much, or you start to have a communication problem. I'm an extrovert. I need to talk. That's been frustrating. And this last one around grief begins when communication ends. And I think this starts out kind of subtly, perhaps. And then over time, people start to realize that this is slowly starting to kind of contribute to making things feel sadder, maybe, to making you feel perhaps more alone in this issue. And you know, there's probably a number of reasons of why this is happening. You know, one, quite honestly, is just talking, if I'm someone with Parkinson's, can sometimes get obviously to be more challenging. My volume, you know, tends to drop in terms of tone. So people aren't able to perhaps hear me as well. I may be very sensitive and aware of this, especially out in public or social situations. So again, I think a lot of things go into the stew, if you will, of why this happens. I do think it is or can be a natural thing that happens. And that's why I pointed out here. And it's not something that can be fixed, right? They can't give you a pill or treatment per se. For this. I think it can be, the reason I pointed out, something that happens as kind of a piece of this. And more importantly, understanding the impact that can have. Now, some people will welcome it, right? If you had a spouse that was a chatterbox, okay, now they have Parkinson's and now they have really started to quiet down, perhaps this isn't an issue. But more often we have the other thing, where people feel like they're not really talking to me anymore. I don't know what's going on with them. They don't want to talk to me. They never say anything. We don't have anything to talk about. You know, all these things can just make this piece of communication. And then people start to feel just kind of a little bit more alone in all this because of the communication that's changing. So some other things that can kind of happen, if you will. This is older research, but has been really well validated since 2000. that care partners here, this is what this study was about, is one of their big challenges, interesting enough, was just sort of seeing their spouse struggle, right? So just kind of the day in and day out of just witnessing, if you will, the struggle, that just the living that, right, can really create a fair amount of difficulty for well spouses. We know that Parkinson's is more than just a movement disorder, even though, of course, it is a movement disorder, but that there are so many of these other motor, non-motor pieces to Parkinson's that to think of it as just a simple motor disorder is, of course, to do it a huge disservice, okay? But I think in the early days, of course, that's the huge focus. And over time, then we really come to realize that it's much more than just that. And people with Parkinson's are going through a range of emotions, sadness, frustration, and especially for care partners, not being able to sort of ease the burden, if you will, of their person with Parkinson's. And sometimes this can, depending on who you are and how you're wired as a caregiver in this case, can have an impact or not have an impact. But if you're someone, this is a quote from a young onset person, I'm a fixer, I'm a mother, I do everything, I fix everything, I make it all better, right? And some people are just wired that way. But when it comes to Parkinson's, you have a formidable foe, right? Because we can't neatly fix it, stop it, prevent it, right? And so some people can manage that a little bit better than others, but certainly for some people, if it's a big part of your identity, you can feel really alone with this, knowing that you can't, and this is sometimes I think what gets caregivers into some degree of struggle or feeling stuck, is that they feel like this is what they should be doing, right? That there should be a way to really fix this. There should be a way for me to be able to kind of rescue this person who I love dearly, perhaps have been with for quite a long time, so that they're not suffering, right? And so just to point out that just seeing it, I'm not even talking about the caregiving piece of it, okay? But just kind of seeing that can often really contribute to a fair amount of some of the stress that folks are going through. The other thing that sort of gets talked about, I think this has gotten better than it was certainly 5 or 10 years ago, is that people with Parkinson's get frustrated, right? They get agitated, they get irritable, they get upset, right? They're just like the rest of us, but they have some different ways of showing that, okay? Because they have Parkinson's. So a lot of times this aggravation or communication gets foisted onto who's ever the closest by. Usually the person that's providing the most support and help tends to be on the receiving end of this. And where that person starts to feel like they've really become the source of the frustration. And I see this a lot around falls, okay, in Parkinson's disease. And it's probably one of the most common conversations that I'm having with folks is that, you know, falls are probably inherently one of the hardest things to manage, right, with Parkinson's. And it doesn't matter, as I often kind of talk about, where you're living. Okay, you can be in the state of the art 24/7 Parkinson's unit, let's say, okay, and falls are going to happen there. All right, you can be living alone at home and falls are going to happen there. So a lot of things that are so hard is because, one, they're all so unpredictable in many ways. to manage. And so what tends to happen, especially if someone has taken a fall and had a really major injury, okay, as a result of the fall, this seems to really then make challenges for managing falls going forward, right? And especially if the care partner feels like in any way they could have done something to prevent the fall, all right? And again, this is very common, okay? And what we really try to do here to try to help lessen some of this agitation and stress is to put the fault where the fault belongs, okay? And the fault belongs on Parkinson's disease, okay? The fault does not belong on the person or on you as the caregiver or any of that. The more that we can really keep the fault on the disease, it can really help people then to be creative about how we're going to try to manage this. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in another slide or so, but this is just one of those really common examples about the frustration level getting very high. And then a lot of times that frustration going towards the caregivers, right? Or the caregiver is constantly on, walker duty, as I call it, right? Like, you don't have your walker. Where's your walker? Why don't you go back to your bedroom? Why are you out here without your walker? All that kind of thing, right? So can add to a fair amount of frustration, okay? He gets frustrated sometimes, takes it out on me. It's just the fact that he can't do things like he used to, right? And some folks are better able to accept that part of it. I can't do it like I used to than others. I think some of that comes back to personality and temperament, which we're not going to change. We can try, but we're not going to. And to really kind of have an understanding about that. All right. So again, some big challenges, and I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about falls. The big one though, managing autonomy versus safety, right? And I really think this is what I call delicate balancing act, especially with disease progression. Okay, so what do I mean by all this? Because it's a big issue that's commonly going on, but people aren't recognizing that's what's going on here, okay? Because it's a lot easier to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of things than the reality of how much freedom and autonomy and sort of personal choice, self-agency does someone have with Parkinson's versus the people that they are living with, loving, that are taking care of them, and their concern around safety, right? I'm sure if I had you all raise your hands here, most of you probably would agree or understand, right? I guess I could have you raise your hands on Zoom. I don't know what I'm talking about there. This is a big one, and it's a common one, and it goes on, I think, almost throughout a big chunk of the disease, certainly those middle years, as I call them, where this can be a constant battle, right? And sometimes I think folks just need that battle. And other times people can find a way through what I'm going to call kind of a compromise or some type of agreement. And it's really hitting, if you can, because there's so many things that can happen with Parkinson's, right? If you can really focus in on the one thing at any given time that really seems to be causing the most stress, and really see if you can work out a compromise that everyone can live with, and try that out. Because otherwise you get so overwhelmed by everything, what happens? You end up doing nothing, okay? Because we're all humans and that's how we're wired. So maybe just if you're in this battle about, again, this comes up a lot around walking, around going up and down stairs. It can be around, being left alone, people have different feelings about that. So finding these areas that are creating the most stress here about how do you allow someone to remain independent as much as possible, and also be able to live with the reality of what's the worst case scenario that could happen here, and can you both, live with that? Okay. And if you can have these frank discussions, and the earlier you can have them, the better off everyone, will be. Okay. So other ideas around, a lot of times I'll hear from people with Parkinson's that they feel like they use the term, or maybe I use the term, but they're talking about it, sort of feeling like they're sort of been taken over or sort of engulfed, okay, by this disease. And sometimes they can feel that way from their care partner, okay, that they're also kind of feeling a little bit engulfed or smothered. It's a hard thing for people with Parkinson. That's why in the old days when I used to run Parkinson's groups, it was way easier. And I think you guys used to do this when you're meeting in person, is to have time for each group of people to be able to talk independent of each other. Okay, because this is when you hear what's really going on, right? Okay. And that's what we want to hear, what's really going on, quite honestly. And that's when people with Parkinson's will say sometimes that, yeah, they're feeling a little bit smothered, or I can never do anything right. That's probably another one that I hear a lot, especially with disease progression. And Parkinson's then can take a big hit to your self-confidence, okay? And when you have people that are maybe overly attending to you, that often doesn't help your self-confidence, all right? And on the flip side, of course, care partners start to feel overwhelmed, stuck sometimes, and trapped. Again, things that they don't often want to talk about or have a harder time talking about with their loved one right next to them, okay? But these are all kind of just those common challenges that are going on for each person, but in a little bit different ways. And the other one is, of course, starting to realize that at some point this journey is going to end, okay? And that's more kind of complicated in many ways, because Parkinson's tends to be a pretty long course of disease. And that sense of sadness, but also recognizing that as well can be important, especially as time is moving along. Okay, so just some simple things that probably I'm preaching to the choir here on this one. But losing some of those things, a big one I hear about is travel. This creates then a fair amount of sadness and some regret sometimes for people, that especially folks that was a big part of what they used to do. Losing some of those valued activities can just contribute, I should say, to some of the sadness that's going on. This is interesting now, being housebound because of dependence. Of course, this shifted tremendously with COVID. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into the COVID piece of it. But that degree of that kind of social isolation, feeling left out, that I can't easily just go down to Wegmans with my spouse like I used to. Everything seems like a little bit of an ordeal, especially getting out of the house sometimes. And so people start to become or feel more sort of dependent on being at home. And I think sometimes spouses in particular, or partners of any type, or even adult children for that matter, kind of have this, they're sort of feel sometimes like, how the person's day goes is sort of how their day is going to go, right? It's sort of like a barometer. And you can feel this constant state of sort of watching, and sometimes watching and worrying, okay? And that can then kind of contribute to people feeling really how they are going to be is very much correlated to how the person with Parkinson's. And that's all well and fine, but it also can over time get to really start to make you feel kind of exhausted and a little resentful all at the same time. And feeling responsible for their well-being is probably the biggest piece of that can contribute to those same kind of feelings. And then also sort of uncertainty, right, about what the future is going to bring. How's this going to go? How hard is it going to get for me? If I'm the person with Parkinson's, how bad is this maybe going to go? Is it just going to kind of level off at some point, so as to speak? A lot of that uncertainty really can contribute. And if you focus yourself on that future uncertainty, it really can create, guess what? A lot of anxiety. Okay. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of how to manage that. So these are just all those challenges. So now that I've talked about kind of all these things that can be going on, the other kind of common piece of things that's going on, it's like a thread that's running through this, whether you all want to sort of recognize it or not, is this idea of you are all grieving in some shape or form. Both the person with Parkinson's and the person that's taking care of them or loving them, okay? And so we'll walk through some of this, okay? Why are you grieving? All right, well, these are some common reasons, okay? It's not grief in the common sense of someone has passed, right? This is really this sort of underlying sadness of the changes and the losses that are going on, and that's why people are grieving. So in particular, the person with Parkinson's, I talked about this a little bit, self-esteem, who you are as a person. I'm constantly probably in my office saying to people, you are not Parkinson's disease, okay? And sometimes people really almost every morning need to get up and have a mantra that they are not this disease. It sounds silly, but it really, what you're telling yourself in your thinking goes a whole long way into how you manage your day, okay? And you will always be able to control what you're saying to yourself. Okay, let me repeat that. You're always going to be able to control what you are saying to yourself. So I think it's important for everyone to realize this, and caregivers too, not to get into that same, you don't want Parkinson's to become a third person in your relationship. Okay, Dr. James Parkinson would not want his disease to have that much power and influence over you. All right. And so it chips away, and it can chip away at not only who you are, but also what you are. Okay. And why are you here? And what is your purpose now? Now you have this thing called Parkinson's. So I always say, you know, people need to have a reason to get up in the morning. Okay. And sometimes Parkinson's can rob that sense of purpose in small ways, and then over time in bigger ways. So that can contribute to it. Sort of what your identity is. Again, you are not the disease, okay? When the disease hits, again, our younger onset folks have a much bigger issue around, often if they're a primary breadwinner or they have young children at home to raise, and now they're at age 45 in the prime of their career, and they've gotten diagnosed with early Parkinson's disease. But even later on, this can have implications. And that can really, how is money managed, you know, within the relationship, okay? It can seem sometimes just a whole lot easier. I'm just going to take care of it, okay? I know how to do it. I can do it well. And you don't realize sometimes the impact of little things like that can have on someone that's dealing with Parkinson's. So it's a lot different to ask about doing things instead of just to move in and do them, right? Obviously, the physical limitations and changes that are happening to the person with Parkinson's, and by default, then the implications for the caregiver. What years ago, a beloved woman with Parkinson's used to use this term, cognition changes. So basically, these are, you know, those subtle changes that can happen with our thinking, okay, that, you know, are not full-blown awful, okay, but they also just make daily life a little bit more frustrating and a little bit harder. Okay, what I call kind of cognition. So these minor changes with our thinking that often, if I'm the person with Parkinson's and I'm having this, can really make me feel, not as good about myself. I can become very frustrated. Why I could always use this keyboard without any problem, and now today I can't seem to use it if my life depended on it, right? So these kind of slower changes around what I call cognition can be quite impactful in terms of how someone feels about themselves. And in particular, how that relates, I think, to social interactions. Some people are much more open, comfortable talking about Parkinson's disease. Other people aren't. So that goes a whole way in terms of how you're socially interacting with people around you. Obviously, changes around sort of physical intimacy, relationship dynamics that often can really shift, of course, over time. Are you not just sort of the wife anymore? Are you sort of the, physician on call? Are you sort of the organizer, the cruise director, the, whatever it might be? So the dynamics within a couple often are going to shift. And then, of course, fear about what lies ahead. So all of those things that I listed can contribute to this sense of grief. And so many people are probably familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work from decades ago. She really identified, this was actually working with cancer patients around grief and loss. And these are stages or phases that people tend to move through. And they are kind of classically very well researched and understood at this point. And just to highlight kind of how this impacts in terms of Parkinson's. So denial, denial, I often say, is not always bad, okay? Especially in the beginning. I think it's quite helpful to some degree for people as they're coming to terms with all this. And often people, when they're in their denial, don't believe their diagnosis. That's quite common. Or go and seek out a number of opinions, or find something on the internet that says this can't possibly be true. Whatever it is, all these things can kind of feed into denial. Feeling just kind of numb by the whole thing. This is a pretty kind of common reaction as well. And kind of limiting who you're telling about, I can have people that have been having Parkinson's for quite a long time that have just really not told their adult children. They don't live in the state, there's really not a reason for them to know. So people have a lot of different ways of dealing with this kind of initial changes. And one of them can certainly be the sense of denial. The other one is anger. I think this is kind of a little bit more common in Parkinson's. Again, a hard thing to talk about. People get very frustrated with, thank God we have so many medications that can help with the symptoms of Parkinson's, but that's a double-edged sword in some ways, because many people over time get kind of pissed off that they got to take so much medication all the time. Okay. And that's normal, and it's easy. We try to be grateful that you have medication to take, but quite honestly, that doesn't always work. Okay. And sometimes people are just angry about it. And you know what? It's okay to be angry about it, and that's normal. All right. People are angry about the darn disease. That's normal. That's where I'd want you to have your anger. Again, not at your loved one or yourself, but at the disease. You can be angry at your doctor. That's a good person to be angry at. Okay. And just feeling like overall, it's not fair. And you're right. It's absolutely not fair. Okay. So all those things can really contribute to anger. People then can get into bargaining. We see this play out around, I'm going to try to be as compliant with my Cinemet as I can for the next 5 days. And then I know if I do that, when I go to see my doctor on Monday morning, he's going to tell me that I'm doing really great. Okay. And so people have these different ways of bargaining about, I'm going to do this now in the hope that this is going to work out. And again, this can pop up around kind of different career and job issues as well. But again, I think for Parkinson's, it's around, if I don't have a fall for the next, year, then I know that, you know, my Parkinson's is really not progressing then. You know, these kind of what I call bargaining kind of things, which generally aren't super helpful, but again, it's some way that people often manage the changes that are going on. Depression, obviously, is a huge one. Again, this is still kind of a big question in the research. Dr. Irene Richard did a lot of the early work at the U of R around this question about, for the person with Parkinson's, is the depression a reaction to having Parkinson's disease, or is it a result of the disease itself? In other words, is there just something inherently about the biology of Parkinson's that causes depression? And probably both of these things, quite honestly, are true, right? Parkinson's, you're losing dopamine. Dopamine is our feel-good neurotransmitter, all right? So of course, it only makes sense that it's going to impact people's mood, okay? And the other thing is the role of depression, that it seems to kind of weave itself, I use the term weave, that probably seems the best one, kind of throughout the course of PD. And the other big one that I always harp about is that about 50% of caregivers at some point in your Parkinson's journey are going to experience a major clinical depression. So not garden variety, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling frustrated, but you are going to experience what we in mental health would really classify as a major depression. And the thing that's generally the best gold standard for major depression is a combination of a nice, perhaps low dose antidepressant combined with someone that you can talk to, that you feel close to, that you can trust. Okay. So the big thing there with caregivers is really not questioning whether or not this is what's going on, but really getting help for that as soon as you really feel like it's happening. And then hopefully coming to some acceptance. I get a lot of pushback about this as well. People see this as giving up or giving in, okay? And that's not what acceptance is about, okay? But really coming to terms with Parkinson's, okay, in your life. And this is really actually lending yourself some self-compassion here and some kindness, which can go a long ways, both for the person with Parkinson's as well as their caregiver, okay? You're not giving up, but you're not beating yourself up. Okay, a big difference. And for care partners, really, I think sometimes they come to this perhaps later than the person with Parkinson's. It varies, but you'll know that you've really reached that when you've let go of that sort of need to fix, the need to control. You've kind of stopped with the nagging, that kind of thing. So some people never get to acceptance, okay, and other folks do earlier on. But it can be quite liberating, I would say, if you can get to that point. And the newest stage, actually, the gentleman that picked up on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is really the 6th stage, which is finding meaning in all of this that we've just talked about. So this really tends to come about after kind of hopefully folks have gotten to a sense of acceptance, is what did this all mean? And that's a big question. I won't go into it too much, but just keeping that on your radar, that this is kind of that last kind of piece of things, really coming to some terms with the role of Parkinson's within your lives and within your relationship. So we're going to shift gears quickly. Oh, I'm recognizing the time, so let me move along. This is an old slide about in the early days of COVID. Wanting to know kind of what zone. There was the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. And I'm hoping now, a good 18 months into it, that people have moved into more of this growth zone, which is what I'm going to kind of talk about, okay? In particular, what I'm calling sort of some of these downstream effects of living with Parkinson's during the pandemic. And this is some of the things that we continue to see going on, just an FYI, okay? The Parkinson's Foundation put out a pretty large survey about midway through 2020, and this is where a fair amount of the data came from. Why does it seem like it's worse for people with Parkinson's, okay? And interesting enough, some of these things are going on for you and have been going on and probably are continuing to go on, okay? it's a little bit harder to be as flexible and as adaptive with Parkinson's disease. Some of that's related, again, to just the loss of dopamine, but we have needed to draw on these tools, right, of being flexible, adaptive throughout the pandemic. So right away, if it's just a little bit harder to do that, because I simply don't have the neurotransmitter that's helping the rest of people that don't have Parkinson's during the pandemic try to adapt, just makes sense. It's going to be a little bit harder for me to be able to draw on those skills because they're just not as fine-tuned as perhaps they used to be. We also saw some worsening of motor function and a reduction in response to Parkinson's medications, okay? Not because anything has changed with one Sinemet, let's say, that it's less effective, okay? But just this role now and the implications of living with the pandemic and under these circumstances seems to be contributing. We probably don't understand all the science behind this at this point because it's still relatively new data and into it. But what I want to say about all this is to really give yourselves a break about this. And I hear this a lot about people that kind of come in maybe for their 6 months checkup into the clinic and are kind of, you know, we do the standard evaluation and kind of hear, gosh, you're really not doing that great. Okay. And some of that is not like you are at some new worse, you know, baseline. It's just that I think people have really had taken more of a hit with their Parkinson's just due to the pandemic, right? Not necessarily because your Parkinson's has gotten worse, but just the long-term implications of trying to cope with Parkinson's while all this pandemic is going on. So the good news there is that I think over time, and we are seeing this, as people are starting to kind of come out of it a little bit more, get re-engaged, get boxing classes up and going, you know, whatever it is, that you will be able to get back to that point of where you're at prior to the pandemic, to not just throw in the towel with it, okay? I think that's a really important thing to remind yourselves of, and to, again, lend some self-compassion can help a lot with that. And don't panic, okay? That's really the big take-home message. It is the time, as I say, to stay on top of your PD game. What do I mean by that? You want to set yourself up for as much success as possible. So this probably really is the time to try to be, you know, as close as you can with your medication management. Some of the things that are going to set you up, knowing that this is a harder time for you, you really want to try to be on top of your game as much as you can. Okay. Dosing your COVID news, that's a long finding what's right for you and might be different than for your spouse or your adult child, and going outside, huge. This is just some of the COVID fatigue, whether you know it or not, that's happening to all of us, what I call managing the hidden sorrows of the pandemic, okay? Again, so just some strategies to help with this sense of Groundhog Day, right? Every day is just the same day. We're doing the same thing. That's what's contributing to just this increasing levels of just overall fatigue and both anxiety and depression that's going on in the general public and really going on, or can be going on, for people like yourselves. And just some strategies there to help with all of that. And I'll drill down into those. So these are some more specifics. And now we're going to lastly shift into just some final tools to try to help with this. I think most of you also are very well fluent around the role of exercise. This is both for the person with Parkinson's, but also the caregiver. Super important, okay, at a variety of levels. And that second one, which I started the talk with, is having somebody that you can talk to. What some of our research now has said to find your 5. And what that means is, do you have 5 people in your life that you could call on and feel like you could call on to help you out, to be there for you if you really needed it? And the goal is to try to find 5 people, okay? If you don't, and many people only have 1, okay? Which is fine too. But the goal from what we know about this is, if you can find your 5, you are going to be in good shape here, okay? Getting some time off from Parkinson's. Of course, the person with Parkinson's doesn't have the beauty of that, but their caregiver certainly should. Okay, and that can be as small as 30 minutes, and it can be as long as a week away, whatever it might be. But finding some daily, not daily, perhaps might be a big ask, but some regular time off from Parkinson's is really important to keep those batteries charged up. Getting some individual counseling support can be very helpful for both people. Again, some of these simple things, some of our research, just some simple breath work. You know, our central nervous systems are kind of, with the pandemic, sort of at this sort of high constant state of sort of high level anxiety. So some ways to help with that is really, you know, just some simple deep breath work, you know, 3, you know, inhale, try to hold that for a count of 4 to 5, and then slowly exhale for a count of 4 to 5. Doing that like 3 times throughout your day, whenever you're feeling super stressed or overwhelmed. It sounds pretty simplistic, but it is a way to really calm down your central nervous system. And you can do that anywhere, which is the beauty of it. The other big one is actually counting backwards from 5, believe it or not. When you are in a stressful situation or about to go into a stressful situation, if you can, in your head or out loud, count backwards slowly from 5. Again, it sounds very simplistic, but a lot of the research really backs up. These are just other ways to kind of help calm down some of that central nervous system. Some other things to, again, build that resilience. We tend to focus on our weaknesses, which is, again, natural. But I'd really have you also try to remember what your strengths are, okay? Because those are what's going to serve you well. And then recognizing things that I don't do too well, can someone else really step in and help with that? Because maybe it's really not my thing, okay? Be aware of promises. I always try to include this in a talk, okay? And by promises, I can mean anything. But of course, some of the big ones that people get into is making promises about the future. And none of us should really do that because none of us really know about the future, right? So I will never put you in a nursing home, okay? That's a promise about the future that you may or may not be able to honor, okay? So I just encourage people to be mindful. I used to say be weary, but I don't really like that word. So be mindful of your promises, okay? Because you may or may not be called to task about them, okay? And again, enlisting others to help out. We've talked a lot about that. Finding way, when someone says, I really want to help you, okay? I understand you're under a lot of stress, you know, with your loved one. I really want to help you, okay? So how do most people respond to that? Oh, that's very nice, thank you. You know, oh, thanks for letting me know, okay? No, 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 okay? When someone offers help, you want to be as specific as possible in the help you need, okay? So if someone offers to help like that, you say, okay, you know what? It'd be great if you can come over on Friday night at 5 o'clock and come and sit with my husband, okay? So what you've done there is you've given a specific, and it helps the person that wants to help to know whether or not they can do that. People want to have something to hang their hat on. So don't miss an opportunity when someone offers to help, but your job is to be as specific as you can, not dismiss it, but to accept it and to really state what your needs are, okay? That gets easier over time when you can practice it more. All right, so I am going to wrap this up. I'm going to just maybe read this really quick. This was actually a quote that our department chairman talked about in the very, very early days of COVID. Remember to be a bit more patient, a bit kinder, a bit more loving, and a bit more understanding, because we're all in this together. I cannot get through this without you, nor you me. So I offer you my hand to help, my ear to listen, my shoulder to cry upon, and my arms to share your load. If I complain today, please do not mark me as a complainer. I just haven't found someone to ease my load. If I seem impatient, please be patient with me. I'm just tired, and self-care is difficult when so many rely upon you. Please don't look at my shortcomings, but instead look at my potential. I'm loaded with it. We are needy. We need laughter, joy, family, comfort, friends, peace, and love. We need each other. This is really hard work. So thank you again. Sorry I went over time there. Hopefully I haven't totally lost you all. And if you want to spend a few minutes with any questions or comments, or just wrap it up, I'm glad to do either. But I really appreciate you listening today.